This is KPPQ-LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the Women's Room, where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. My guest today is Colleen Coffey, Associate Professor of History and Women's Studies course instructor at Ventura College. Hi, Colleen.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So happy to have you here to continue our discussion. And today is part 2 of a discussion of a book Ms. Coffey uses in her Women's Studies course. The book is The Body Project, An Intimate History of American Girls by Joan Jacobs Brumberg. Colleen, we ended last time by talking about differences between Victorian adolescents and young girls in America today. Could you give us, our audience, a little recap of our discussion so far?
Absolutely. With Victorian girls and women, we see a much more protective and supportive environment between the generations, where younger girls are getting a lot more guidance as they embark on first menstruation and reproductive years, marriage, etc. In the modern day, there is much, much less of that.
So Victorian girls had a lot more protections across society,
right?
And contemporary girls just don't. So we discussed this briefly in our last discussion, but I think it's worthy of another pass at it. So has the sexual revolution been so great for young girls?
It's not. It's been rather a complicated situation because in the modern day, the physical event of menstruation has moved down chronologically so that women menstruate about age 12, whereas in Victorian times they would have menstruated much later. But cognitive development is stagnant. So you have girls in this climate of post-sexual revolution where there's much more promiscuity and much more exposure to human sexuality and sexual situations at a time in their life when cognitively they're not ready to sort of process those events in the way that they need to.
So that actually girls are exposed to sexual matters, talk, and activities at a much younger age. What age are we talking about?
We're looking at about 13 nowadays.
Very young.
Very, very young.
Yeah.
And we also see as a consequence of that girls are more what's the word I'm looking for? More capable when they're younger. But as they pass through puberty, they become much more likely to have depression, to commit suicide, eating disorders, substance abuse, as compared to boys. And part of that is that piece of that exposure to things that you don't have enough support and you're just not able to process it.
Right. So talk a little bit about, Ms. Brumberg talks about it, initiation rites of the American girl compared to the initiation rites for the menarche or the onset of menstruation in more primitive cultures. I guess, first of all, tell us about a couple of initiation rites.
Right. Well, this is something that we cover in my women's history class when they talk about Native American women in, say, the 17th century, when Europeans are first encountering them. And they note that when women are menstruating, they're segregated from the population. And that is a time for them to engage in spiritual activities and meditation and a more sort of contemplative mode of life. Mm-hmm. They are relieved of work duties, of childcare, of all those things.
So they're actually able to kind of contemplate their procreative powers.
Right. It's viewed as a very powerful time for them, so powerful that segregation is appropriate. And again, that is a time to pursue the spiritual for that time. It's also important to note that menstruation is less frequent than it is in the modern era because of more childbearing and prolonged lactation. So that's a factor in it. But that's one of those sorts of rites that they have. Nowadays, we don't have any kind of rituals. Our conversation is entirely about hygiene, the mechanics of it. How do you deal with this thing rather than what does it mean sort of emotionally for the women that are going through it, and what does it mean for your life's course?
Right. And again, the power that these girls becoming women need to understand.
Right. It's not viewed as powerful anymore. It is viewed as a problem. It has to be dealt with.
So that we can, run off and go swimming and run in
Precisely.
run in races.
Precisely. It's not about the power of this event, and it is powerful. Reproductive capacity is a marvel, but it's not treated that way. We're not having that conversation.
Right. So what is the closest thing we have to an initiation rite? You mentioned it, but I wanted to make sure this got covered.
That's a very good question. I don't know what the initiation rite would be. Maybe it's, in the 20th century, it was more the mother getting a pamphlet that came from a product manufacturer, and she gives it to the daughter, and that's her information. Nowadays, it might be a young woman that crosses over from pads to tampons, perhaps. I mean, we don't have any kind of spiritual, emotional ritual that really goes with it. It's very informational, very matter of fact.
Right, and product oriented.
And very consumer oriented.
The right type of sanitary hygiene will get you through.
Can you get through that soccer game or the swim class or whatever you're doing? How do you get through it? How do you manage the pain? It's not an emotional conversation.
Now, the Victorians thought of menstruation time as being debilitating.
Yes, they would. If women talked about it at all in diaries, which is rare, but if they did, they might allude to being unwell. And that would be the way that they described it. But they did see it as a debilitating, sort of vulnerable moment for women. Nowadays, the consumer market is oriented toward continuing with everything you would normally do, and we have products that will make that possible.
Right. So, I heard what you said about the 20th century. My personal experience replicated almost exactly Miss Brumberg's description. My mother got this pamphlet from Kotex, and she got some samples, and she gave them to me. And she said, read this book, and if you have any questions. And then she went about cooking, and I sat there with the book, very embarrassed.
Very embarrassing.
Yes, and I knew at that time it was, my mother really was not the kind of person who could talk about it or felt herself capable. So, I read the book, and then she put it away in her top dresser drawer, just as
we won't need this anymore.
Right. And then whenever she was gone, I'd go and get it and try to puzzle it out. So there was really no talk at all, no frank talk.
No.
She was embarrassed.
No, and I've talked to some of the women in my own family that are the older generation. I was raised by a hippie. She was very forthcoming. Our Bodies Ourselves was on the bottom shelf of the bookcase where it could be accessed by us girls at any time. But for that older generation especially, but continuing now, the conversation, if it happens at all, is hygiene oriented. How do you handle this? And that is the end of the discussion. It's not about reproductive capacity and womanhood.
And that's the kind of frank talk that would really help girls who end up getting themselves into trouble.
That's what that protective umbrella that Brumberg talks about should be made of in the modern era, that frank conversation. But in too many families, that's not taking place. What girls learn, they hear more often from peers.
So the American girl is pretty much preoccupied with the body. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, and I would say I don't think it's confined to young girls. I think all American women are preoccupied by body projects and the external, and our culture is very unforgiving in that way. It's relentless is what it is.
I do not know a woman who doesn't worry about her weight.
Right. Or her skin, or how she's dressed, or how many gray roots are popping through from my last dye job. It's not just young. It is arguably more destructive for the young emotionally, but none of us are immune to those concerns.
Right. And why do you think this is so? Why are we so preoccupied?
Well, a lot of it has to do with media exposure, which is relentless in our current culture.
Right.
Tabloids screaming out to you from every grocery store, checkout stand. Celebrity A is too fat. Celebrity B is too thin. Celebrity C had a muffin for breakfast and took an unflattering photo. She must be pregnant.
So another thing that we all think about is what is wrong with various parts of our body.
Yes.
Like my hips are too big.
Right.
I'm bloated. The list goes on and on.
Right. That's a product actually of the 1920s is the beginning of that, because that's when standardized clothing comes onto the market. And so previously a dress would be made to fit the woman.
Oh, right.
So you don't really give much thought to your dimensions in that climate. But when you have to fit the dress, now the shape of your body becomes an enormous concern. My bust is too big. My hips are too wide. That becomes the consuming obsession. And so the 20s are the beginning of that mass marketed clothing.
Wow. I know that different clothing manufacturers actually have their own size. So if you go to a store that is not the kind of, doesn't have the dimensions or proportions that you have, the clothes don't fit. And then you end up, hating yourself. And think, no, I must have gained weight.
It's even more insidious. Some manufacturers deliberately sew their clothes bigger but number them smaller to sort of psychologically ease women's minds. Like, oh, great, I'm a 6. And they keep buying those clothes because psychologically that feels better than going to the Gap where you're actually a size 10.
Right. It's very true.
It is true.
I have a friend who, just really needed to lose weight. Well, according to our standards today.
Right.
And then did. And I think she tried on a pair of pants. We were out, and she said, "A 14. I've never been been able to wear a 14 before."
And she will keep buying those pants.
Yeah, she probably will.
Exactly.
So, how are the beauty industry, economics, and body projects all related?
Oh boy, they cannot be separated, because this is an industry selling women how they look and products to fix how they look is, hundreds of millions of dollars every single year. And it's not something that you use for a day or a week, but something you use forever. From junior high or even late grammar school until the grave, and you are buying products.
Right.
And so for every age, for every concern, the market has developed a product for you. It fixes pimples, it fixes wrinkles, it dyes your gray roots. I recently bought a crayon that can color my hair between dye jobs. If a gray hair should pop out of my head, you just color it away with crayon. There it is.
Wow.
They develop a product for everything. And that drives consumerism, and this obsession with how women look keeps them going back to the store to buy again and again and again.
So it would be very difficult for us to go back to a Victorian sort of psychology of helping women develop their character and their personality foremost, and their virtues, rather than their body.
No, I don't think it's possible to turn back the clock. What we could do a better job with is supporting one another, recognizing that this is the world that we live in. Let's not tear one another down based on how we look, which is too often what is happening. It's the mean girl syndrome, and that's the thing that we need to fix.
We need to stop saying, oh, those little catty remarks. Oh, my
Yes.
God, did you see what she's gained?
Exactly that. And that's what's really destructive to women. We can't go back, but we definitely could support each other. We're all guilty of that behavior at some point in our lives. Some are meaner than others, of course, but none of us is totally innocent of the catty remark, the casual put down. That's the things that we need to work on.
So do you think that women are actually more critical of other women than men are?
I asked that to my students. I sort of had a sense of it, but I wanted to hear what they thought. And when I asked my students that, they resoundingly agreed that women were, like when women dressed up, let's say, to go out for an evening, they did that for other women as much as to impress their male peers or whoever it was that they were trying to impress that was male. That the women were the ones that were most likely to be critical. Did you see her shoes? That skirt is ridiculous. That's the kind of talk. It's for one another. Men don't notice. I challenge every woman, go ask the man in your life what the difference between tights and leggings is. He cannot tell you, but a woman can.
Oh, right. That's a great question. So to go back to the book and the history again, Brumberg describes the bob haircut, pimples, and the bra as all having helped shape attitudes toward the exterior. Maybe we could just start with a bob haircut. What is a bob haircut?
Right. The bob haircut is, we still see it today. It's a cut that's very straight and short and sort of cropped at the jawline to a greater or lesser extent. You have a very short bob or a slightly longer one. And that's something that came about in the 20s, and young women embraced it. Prior to the 20s, your crowning glory was your hair. That's the stereotype of the Gibson girl, a woman with a huge pile of hair with little
the pompadour
curls hanging down from every edge, and a fancy hat. And so young women in the 20s, as an assertion of their young womanhood, cropped their hair entirely off. It was viewed as almost masculine sort of a haircut in the time. Very radical, very upsetting to parents.
Okay, well, let's just leave that there for a moment. We'll come back to it. We'll take a break here. This is KPPQ-LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the Women's Room, where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good, and I'm talking to Colleen Coffey, Professor of History and Women's Studies instructor at Ventura College, and we're discussing the book, The Body Project, An Intimate History of American Girls by Joan Jacobs Brumberg. Okay, and we're back. Did you want to talk a little bit more about how the bob haircut created the more independent woman?
Right. Well, kind of like the Gibson girl before her, every era has its icon in terms of female beauty. And in the 20s, the bob and an extremely thin, slender, almost childlike physique becomes the visual ideal for women. And so lots of girls cut all their hair off. And that is when diets emerge in full force. We start reading about them in magazines as women start to try to really manipulate their body size to conform to the new fashion, which was this very straight silhouette, not busty, not wide hips, and this very, very short haircut. So that becomes the ideal, the sort of icon of the 20s.
So that's when all our troubles started.
Right. You
or
might
some
say,
of our troubles.
Yes, that's it's almost like the precursor of Twiggy. You know,
right,
that will come back around in the 60s. It emerges in the 20s. Then if you look to like the post-World War II era, and even during the war, it's a very curvy physique is what is most desirable. It's said that Marilyn Monroe was like a size 14 or a size 12.
I think she was a 16.
Perhaps so.
Yeah.
Right, like a very curvy, busty figure is desirable. But then by the time we get to the 60s, once again, we're back to this extreme slenderness, no bust, no hips, very childlike.
Do you think that's related to the growth of independence or emancipation of women in the 20s when they began to become more independent, more the shift dress, and then again in the Twiggy generation? I mean, I grew up in that generation, and everyone we're just totally worried about our body shape.
Right, the physique.
Many of us are not that shape.
I thought about that before. That does sort of coincide. That will have to be something I think about. It's true in both eras that becomes, for women in the 20s, cutting your hair off, wearing that clothing, smoking and drinking in public, being part of public culture with men, co-ed culture, that becomes an assertion of female independence. We're not going to live like our mothers did. I'm my own person, and you express that physically in the way that you look.
Right. You're not going to wear the ruffles and the corset.
Right. All of that is thrown out the window.
Wow. So what about the pimples?
Yes. Well, that is in her book. It's actually one of the, I think, most sort of interesting chapters, but in a way that's rather lurid, because they describe how the condition of a woman's skin becomes not just a girl's concern, but that middle-class parents become intensely concerned about the way their young daughters look, because it might otherwise discourage marriage. They won't be able to find heterosexual partners if they don't look right. And so Brumberg describes these many, sometimes very graphic treatments that they use to try to cure young women of pimples, x-rays and all sorts of creams of various acids, injections, harsh, what would you call abrasive, like scrubbing of the face, almost like it take the top layer of skin off and let it regrow with the hope that it would be healthier than what had been there before. But again, this becomes one of the first issues where middle-class parents become sort of co-conspirators in the body project, helping daughters and being as concerned as they are about how they look.
Right. So the bra comes up next.
Right.
I can see you have a lot to talk about that.
So the thing with bras, again, bras operate in the service of fashion. So in the 20s, bras are, when the silhouette is desirable to be very flat-chested, bras are extremely constricting, make the breasts as flat as possible so that a woman can fit into that sort of flapper-style dress.
Right.
Then you get to the post-World War II era, and the bras become very pointy. I mean, they're almost comic to look at now, how conical they get. But that becomes the fashion there. So we have to take the breast and put it into that shape. And then you move to the next era, and Twiggy's back in the 60s. So, we have to flatten them out again. You get to the 80s now, breast augmentation becomes enormously popular. So now you have breasts that are, far beyond what is sort of an ordinary size. And so in all those, I think what you see is that women's shape has to keep changing. And the years I just described would span a single woman's lifetime from the 60s to the 80s. So when she's a young woman, she should have no breasts. By the time she's 40, she should be a triple D. How is an individual woman supposed to cope with these changing
I'm getting a headache thinking about it.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, like, it's another reason our culture has such discomfort with breastfeeding, because for Americans, the bust is a consuming occupation. And so when you actually put that to use for what it's intended, it creates a lot of discomfort for a lot of people.
Just because the breast needs to be exposed?
Right, because
somewhat?
a breast is a sexual object. It's part of a woman's appearance. It's the aesthetic. We want to admire them. We don't want to see a baby hanging off of them.
Wow. Oh, amazing stuff. Well, let's talk a little bit about social media. Now, how does that affect young women today?
For young women today, social media is, it can be really destructive. And here's why. Because what's going on for a lot of young women, especially, follow celebrities on social media. Say Kim Kardashian is easy to sort of pick on for this. And young women follow her and they emulate her, and she is beautiful and we want to look like her. And what they're not thinking about is that Kim has at least one staff person, probably 3, that are on call 24/7 to Photoshop every single picture of her. Every selfie she takes, she sends to be Photoshopped to utter perfection before it's posted to Instagram or wherever it's going. And young women are not thinking about that. Same with like Katy Perry, my friend's daughter. She loves Katy Perry. She's not thinking about, she's 11 or 12. She's not thinking about the dude with the laptop at 2 a.m. that is making Katy look like Katy.
Right.
Absolutely not. All she's seeing is the end product, and why don't I look like that?
Or look like what the ideal Katy is, not the actual Katy.
Right.
Yeah.
And they have no idea what that person actually looks like. And so it becomes really destructive because it's an impossible ideal that can never be achieved.
Right.
And so social media is just amping that up, repeated exposure, more and more and more and more.
Wow. So what about, the postings on Facebook, like, boys raping a girl? I mean, it's just terrible.
It's super bad. And the problem with things like that is that, and there's all kinds of that. I just read an article in the New Yorker about a girl who was, well, not a girl, she was a woman and a lawyer. And she had taken on these cases where men are filming women that they're in relationships or simply have sexual encounters with, and then later they post those things online on social media. They call it revenge porn, and these girls are being put out there and they have no idea that this has been posted, or something happens to them at the party. Maybe they were drunk. unbeknownst to them, it was filmed. Next thing you know, it's out on social media. And the thing about that is that I think it normalizes it. As much as people are outraged, the more this happens, it's like gun violence. It starts to seem like, oh yeah, that happened again. That's terrible. But it's not an appropriate response for how outrageous that is.
Right. So your students, when they study about the Victorian approach, the protective umbrella, for how do they feel about this? I mean, what are their comments?
Well, I think it's twofold. I think on the one hand, like most Americans that, know anything about the Victorians, they view it as a very sort of repressive age. Mm-hmm. So I think they certainly value the freedom that young women have today, particularly the freedom that comes with having the normalization of co-ed relationships and being able to have the sexual freedoms that they do and access to birth control, something that I know we want to talk about later. So they see the Victorians as repressed and sort of prudish that way. At the same time, I hope through women's history, they start to see that the situation they're in is perilous and that sexism is still rampant and that we can't be duped by freedom into thinking that we're on an equal playing field. They're not. So I hope in some way that exposure to women's history helps them see some of the caveats and the gray areas, that it's not just, a wonderful new free world. There's some real pit holes in that girls can fall into. It can be very dangerous because they don't have the support that, their ancestors in the 19th century would have had.
Yeah, that's just my next question. Do they themselves feel like they have any protection or support?
I probably need to ask that question. I think they would feel supported by peers for the most part. A lot of my students have intact families. A lot of them come from really broken families. Mm-hmm. A lot of them are single parents, and they are a family of two, a mom and a child.
Right.
So
mom usually working,
right, and so I think it really ranges for how much support they have. I think it's, even though we can see norms and sort of consistent things across time, there's a lot of individual variation. I do find with young women, they really want to talk about women's issues, about being a girl. And so I think we need to encourage those conversations as much as we can and support them as adults. Right. And sort of like older women, because they're adult, my students, but to support them and help guide those conversations in productive ways, drawing on our experience as the Victorians would have.
And that's exactly what Brumberg in her book says, that, that's what young girls need. They need to be able to talk to adult women, whether it's their mothers or their aunts or
that you have
instructors.
Those. Yeah, exactly. Right. She talks about it being social Gore-Tex, that's what protects them, is information and support.
Okay. Well, we have just about a minute left. I was just wondering, if you could kind of recap or say anything that, we didn't get to.
Well, the thing about this book that I think makes it a really interesting read for any American woman is that it really teaches you how the world that we live in came into being. So if you're curious about that and wondering why the aesthetics matter so much in our presidential elections, in any kind of situation in America today, this book shows you how we got from there to where we are now.
And which is good reason for studying history.
Also good reason for studying women's history, yes.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Colleen. I've enjoyed this immensely. And
thank you for having me very much.
I think our audience did too. This is KPPQ-LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the Women's Room, where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good, and I've been talking to Professor of History at Ventura College, Colleen Coffey. The book we've been discussing, The Body Project by Joan Jacobs Brumberg, is available at your local library.